Good morning and welcome back to the Monday study group. A few of you are new to the study group, so maybe it's not welcome back for you, but thank you for all for being here. We are in the season of Lent. With the first Sunday in Lent has just passed, and we are using this study of Mark maybe to think about deepening our relationship with God, and particularly focusing on Jesus as he is in his last week of earthly life, and the suffering that he is undergoing. It gives us a focus that deepens our devotion. And I hope that's in part what these videos do as well, and this study does for you. Well, let's begin with prayer. God, it is the hope of our minds and hearts that you will guide us, that through the study you will be present with us, to teach us, to help us, to learn, to affect us at levels beyond just our mind, but that somehow what we study and say and learn as we read would sink deeper into our consciousness and enable us to be more faithful followers of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. Maybe this morning I'll adhere a little more closely to the study questions, and you can follow along in the narrative of Mark's Gospel in whatever translation or version you are using. I'll say a little bit maybe at the start here about translations and versions. I'm using typically the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. The Revised Standard Version, without the word new in front, was a translation that was published in the 1940s in the English-speaking world, and was a revision of the authorized version, the so-called King James Version. And so its principle was to adhere as closely as possible to the King James language, which was very literal to the Greek texts that were known at that time, but to incorporate up-to-date textual variations, readings, new things that scholars had learned about the most likely original versions of all the passages in the New and Old Testaments since 1947 or so, when the Revised Standard Version came out. Now we are using the New Revised Standard Version, which incorporates other updates and is less concerned than the old RSV was to adhere to the King James Version style and even wording wherever possible. That was a very conservative translation. But today, many people use the NIV, the New International Version. I really like the New Living Translation, which is a complete separate living translation. The CEB, the Common English Bible, is also widely used and is a fine translation as well. So you may be using one of those, or maybe even some other translation, but the comments that I have written for you that I send out as study questions, and the comments I'll be using, the questions and comments that I'll be using this morning, are drawn mainly from the New American Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version. The NASV, I think, came out in 1985 maybe, or 95. I think 95. So it's 30 years old now. And it also has undergone revisions and updates as scholars have made better decisions about what aspects of the translation need to be revised. All right, starting with verse 43, we've already seen Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. The disciples were unable to stay awake during his time of prayer and agony and suffering. He was distressed and agitated and prayed that the suffering that was about to happen to him might not have to occur if possible. Nevertheless, each of his times of prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane ended with, "Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done, O God." So now, at the end of that time, Jesus just said to his disciples, "Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs, and they came from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. So this is a arresting mob sent out by the Jerusalem temple authorities, primarily the Jewish council and the temple authorities, to arrest Jesus. Judas has betrayed the best time to get to Jesus, when he would be with fewer people than he would be if he were in Jerusalem during the daytime in one of the festival areas of celebration. Mark emphasizes that Judas is one of the 12 because it adds to the treachery of the situation. He's one of Jesus' closest disciples and one of the 12, and he is the one who now comes with this armed mob to betray, to enable the arrest and handing over. The word for betray in Greek is literally to hand over, to give over, and to do so to the mob that has come from the high priest's office. So in verse 44, the treachery or irony of this situation that one of Jesus' very own disciples is betraying him is added to by Judas identifying Jesus with a kiss of friendship. So he's offering this Middle Eastern kiss of friendship, probably on each cheek, and calling his leader, rabbi, or teacher. These are gestures of intimacy, friendship, and respect. How ironic then, and how treacherous then, that Judas, how villainous, I suppose you could say, that Judas uses these signs of intimacy to lead to and cause the arrest and handing over of his master, the one who he's been following and whose disciple he was. He just wants Jesus arrested and handed over to the guards, even though the crowd is armed with clubs and swords. It does not appear that Judas wants Jesus to be injured, and in fact, some people have thought that maybe Judas wanted this arrest to take place non-violently, and that Jesus would then exercise his authority and power and ability and call upon God to deliver him, the Messiah, and stand up against the Romans. Instead, Jesus emphasizes his vulnerability. Jesus identifies with us in our vulnerability. He allows himself to be handed over to suffering and death, much as we as humans are completely vulnerable to aging, to diseases, to events that occur in our social and political circles. We have little power to change those circumstances many times. And so we are vulnerable, just as Jesus here identifies with us by being himself completely vulnerable. So when they seized Jesus and laid hands on him to arrest him, one of Jesus' disciples, it doesn't even say that in Mark that it was a disciple, it just says one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Well, in one of the other Gospels, we learn that that was Peter who did that. Peter had a sword. We knew at the Last Supper that there were at least two swords present among the disciples, and maybe more than one of the disciples was a zealot, an armed rebel against the Roman occupation. But Peter apparently has a sword, and he tries to resist the arrest of Jesus by cutting off the ear. If Peter's right-handed, he probably cuts off the left ear of the other person, or maybe the right ear. I don't know. This is my right ear. He uses his right hand to cut that ear off. One of the other Gospels says Jesus actually heals the ear and puts it back. That's not in Mark. But Peter at least is prepared to resist this arrest of his teacher. Jesus, nevertheless, says to the arresting mob led by Judas, "Have you come out with clubs and swords to arrest me as if I were a bandit? Day after day I taught in the temple and you didn't do anything there." Maybe he's underlining their cowardice, that they have to do this under the cover of night. We know that the authorities wanted to arrest Jesus as privately as possible to avoid creating a riot or any kind of mob action against them if it were done in public in Jerusalem. So Jesus is now arrested. He is taken away by the guards, the people who have come from the Jerusalem authorities, and this causes all of his disciples to desert him. Well, this is exactly what Jesus said would happen back in verse 27. Jesus said to his disciples during the Last Supper, "You will all become deserters, for it is written, 'I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered.'" A quote from Zechariah, I think. Jesus had predicted they would all be deserters, and then Mark says, "And all of them deserted him and fled," in verse 50. And then we get this strange incident of the unnamed young man, also a follower of Jesus, whom the mob tried to capture. There was a young man following, wearing nothing but a linen cloth, is perhaps that he slept in. It was the middle of the night. This Passover meal had ended about midnight. They'd gone into the garden. Jesus had been praying. It's 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. This guy is there following Jesus in his nightshirt. And they catch hold of him as all of the rest of the disciples of Jesus were fleeing. They catch hold of this guy and haul him back, or try to haul him back with his garment, and it rips off, and he runs away naked. Now, one of my commentaries, the Larry Hurtado commentary, and maybe your commentary as well, cites Amos 2:16 here. I'll read that for you. Amos 2:16, "And those who are stout of heart among the mighty shall flee away naked in that day. So Amos is emphasizing that at the time he lives, there will be a judgment coming upon the people of Israel, so that even those who are stout and mighty will flee away naked in that day. Perhaps Mark included this event as a fulfillment of Amos 2:16. I had never thought of that before. I had just assumed, as the tradition, post-biblical tradition after the New Testament, I'd always assumed that this was Mark's little memoir, his signature moment, in which Mark himself, John Mark, if he is the young man, and that's speculative, completely speculative. We have no other reason to identify this young man with Mark, other than that this might be Mark's way of saying that he too ran away and was a deserter, along with all the other disciples of Jesus. And so they took Jesus immediately to the high priest. I think all four Gospels, despite the differences among them about the events of the last week of Jesus' life, and especially about the events of the trial and execution of Jesus. If you do compare that in all the other Gospels, you'll see there's some variations of detail. But all of them agree that the next move was for the mob that had come from the chief priests, the scribes and the elders, the authorities in Jerusalem, the council or Sanhedrin. They took Jesus back to that group, to the high priest, and perhaps to the high priest's house himself. Verse 53 says they took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and elders and the scribes were assembled. This appears to be a night meeting, a hastily called night meeting of the council. Peter is introduced next. Jesus is taken into the interrogation that the high priest has set up. Caiaphas is his name. And Peter follows Jesus at a distance. Well, a disciple is a follower of Jesus, but here Peter is now at least following like a disciple should, but he's following at a distance. He's already distancing himself from Jesus. He was one of those who deserted Jesus, but he's loyal enough that he wants to at least see what happens. And so Peter follows at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. That's a risk Peter is taking. And he was sitting with the guards, warming his hands in the fire. Yes, I think it was a risk that Peter took to do this, and it proves later that it was a risk. So then Mark, using his sandwich technique, has introduced Peter following Jesus right into the courtyard and warming himself by the fire, the open fire in the courtyard. But now he shifts back to Jesus' trial or interrogation by the high priest and by others. And then he's going to come back later to Peter. So the Peter story is sandwiched around the interrogation of Jesus by the Jewish authorities. All right, on to the trial of Jesus. So the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus, serious enough that they could put him to death or seek the death penalty. But Mark says they found none. There were witnesses, but they gave false testimony against Jesus, and even their false testimony didn't agree. And so Mark gives us an example. Some people stood up and gave false testimony against Jesus by saying, well, we heard him say this, I will destroy the temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. There's a grain of truth in each half of that testimony. Let's look at it again. We heard Jesus say, I will destroy this temple that all the Jews worship in, the center of Jewish religious life. I will destroy this temple made with hands. Well, did Jesus ever say that? No, he said that the temple would be destroyed. He said the time is coming soon, maybe even in the lifetime of those listening to him, that the temple would be destroyed. Did he say he would destroy it? No, he predicted the temple would be destroyed. So that this is twisted testimony, twisted to say that Jesus said he would destroy the temple, when in fact he just predicted it would be destroyed. And what about the second half of the false testimony? In 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Well, Mark's readers would identify the 3 days as the 3 days of Jesus' death before the resurrection. After 3 days he will rise again, and he will become the center of worship, taking the place of the temple. So in 3 days I will build another temple, but not made with hands. Yes, a spiritual temple that is Jesus himself. After 3 days he rises from the dead and becomes the center of devotion for Christians in the same way that the temple was the center of devotion. But did Jesus say he would build it, a temple not made with hands? No, not exactly, but something like that. So this testimony is already twisted with a grain of truth in it, but not what Jesus ever said. But even in this point, it says their testimony did not agree. And so the high priest gets tired of this. One of our members this morning in the discussion pointed out that this whole trial and arrest had been choreographed by the high priest, and he expected it to go well, and he expected it to achieve the outcome that he wanted it to achieve, which was the condemnation of Jesus, so that they could turn him over to the Roman authorities with enough charges that the Romans would want to put Jesus to death. But it's not going well. They can't even get 2 witnesses to agree to the same testimony, and the testimony is not the kind of testimony that the Romans would care anything about. So the high priest takes over the questioning in verse 60. Then he stood up before them and asked Jesus point blank, how come you're not answering? Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you? Well, this reminds us, Jesus' silence reminds us, of course, of the passage from Isaiah that as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he will not open his mouth. And Jesus is silent here. The silence of Jesus before this false testimony and before Pilate in his accusations reminded early Christians of that passage from Isaiah, where it said that the servant of the Lord, whom the passage in Isaiah is about, will be silent before his accusers. Jesus doesn't answer. He's simply silent. He cannot be provoked by the false testimony. He's simply silent. Perhaps he knows that the high priest knows that none of this is valid. And so he was silent and did not answer. And so the high priest now asks him point blank, directly, are you in fact the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One, that is, the Son of God? And now Jesus says something that is very dramatic and striking and a culmination or climax of the whole Gospel of Mark. Jesus says in answer to the high priest, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of God, that is, the right hand of power, and coming with the clouds of heaven. Jesus says, I am. This I am, by most readers of the New Testament in Mark's time, but maybe even by the high priest himself, would be a direct reference to Exodus 3:14, where God says to Moses, I am whom I am. I am who I am. Jesus here says, I am. And then he adds a passage from Daniel 7:13 about the Son of Man receiving power from the Most High, seated at the right hand of God, and coming on the clouds of heaven. Jesus foresees that the Son of Man, his favorite self-designation, will come to judge the world, will come on the clouds of heaven to be God's agent of judgment. Well, the high priest thinks that this is enough, that this bold declaration of Jesus, contradicting really all that of the silence that Jesus had been commanding throughout the Gospel of Mark, is enough to condemn him. And so whether what Jesus said was blasphemy or not, the high priest thinks that by calling it blasphemy, he can get the council to agree that Jesus should be put to death. I don't think what Jesus says here is blasphemous. The claim to be Messiah would not be blasphemous. But Jesus so closely associates himself with God, he agrees that he is the Son of God and that he is seated at the right hand of God. That's associating yourself maybe too closely with the divine being, the unity of God. And so the high priest may think that's enough to condemn Jesus as blasphemy. If not, he simply wants the rest of the council to go along with it, whether it's true or not. He's using his authority to say, let's consider this blasphemy. We've heard it. It's enough. What is your decision? And all of them condemned him. And once they've condemned him as deserving death, whether it's true or not, they condemn him as deserving death. They began to use violence against him. They reinforce their decision by physical violence, spitting on Jesus, beating him, attacking him, and even the guards took him over and beat him. And they blindfolded him while they were doing this. How horrific for Jesus not to see where the blows are coming from. And they mock him by saying, well, prophesy. You're certainly a prophet. Everybody thinks you're a prophet. Say something prophetic. So Jesus is now condemned by the council, the Jewish council, meeting at night and condemning him as deserving death. And we'll see what their next move is. But Mark wants to go back to finish the Peter story, and he does so in verse 66. Now Peter was below in the courtyard where we left him, and one of the servant girls comes by, just a mere servant girl. Here Jesus has been interrogated by the high council of Judaism, and Peter is now going to be interrogated by a simple servant girl in the courtyard. Peter's warming himself by the fire, and she stares at him, and she said, you also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth. I think I've seen you with him. And he said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand what you're talking about. Jesus who? I'm just here warming myself by the fire. I don't know what you're talking about. And he went out into the forecourt. That is, he went out of the immediate courtyard. He's withdrawing from the place where he was identified closer to Jesus, and he's withdrawing now out of the courtyard, perhaps where he won't be quite so visible in the light of the fire. And the cock crowed the first time, but Peter apparently doesn't catch that yet. And the servant girl, this nosy, impudent nuisance, from Peter's point of view, keeps following him. And she goes out into the forecourt also. And she says to the bystanders out there, and who are these bystanders in the middle of the night? Well, they're probably part of the mob that went out to arrest Jesus, and now they've come back to see what the outcome is of this arrest and trial, and they've been warming themselves by the fire, but now they're just standing around, and the servant girl, instead of talking directly to Peter like she did the first time, saying to him, you also were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth. She doesn't even accuse him of anything else other than being an associate of Jesus. But Peter doesn't want to be accused of guilt by association with Jesus, so he denies it. And this time, the girl says to the bystanders, this guy was one of them. Well, that them is kind of a universal term, isn't it, for people we don't like? The outsider, the them, us versus them. And he's one of them. He's one of those Galilean troublemakers, people who've been stirring up trouble wherever they go, followers of this so-called Messiah. He's one of them. And again, Peter said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. He denied it. But then the bystanders take up the interrogation of Peter. So we move on from the servant girl. She's stirred up enough trouble. Now the bystanders again say to Peter, you really are. You are one of them. She's right, because you're a Galilean. And they know that by his accent. One of the other Gospels tells us that. You're a Galilean. And Peter finally has had enough, and he begins to curse and swear an oath. May God strike me down if I know this man. I don't know this man who you're talking about. May God, if that's a lie, may God strike me down. The curse or the swearing is a self curse. You are cursing yourself if you're telling a lie. May lightning strike me, or may God strike me if I am not telling the truth, that I do not know this person, whoever it is that you're talking about. And Peter, for the third time, has denied any association with Jesus. The cock crows. Peter wakes up mentally, morally, remembers that Jesus has said to him, before the cock crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. The Greek verb here, epibalo, means to fall down or to throw against. Metaphorically, he emotionally breaks down and weeps out of guilt, out of recognition that he has been the deserter that he said he wouldn't be, and he has broken his friendship and his association with Jesus. He wouldn't even defend Jesus to say he'd been an associate of his. And so that's where we leave it. Peter, if you're one of Mark's readers, you want to be like Jesus. Tell the truth. Say who you really are. Confess that you are a disciple, a follower of Jesus, the Son of God, the one whom God sent to be the deliverer of his people and of all people. Don't be like Peter, who denied Jesus under pressure in the face of trouble, and would not even confess to associating with Jesus. So Mark's readers are to see Jesus as a positive example and Peter as the example not to follow here. That was a pretty powerful thing after by 60 or so AD when the Gospel of Mark was written, and Peter was the leader of all the earliest Christians, and yet here is shown to be fallible, vulnerable, human, just like Mark's readers, who also may have to suffer for their faith. All right, well, that will take us through chapter 14. And next week, we will pick up with the Roman trial of Jesus and his actual crucifixion and death. Blessed Lent.